Good morning and welcome to Liverpool Responds. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speakers today. We are joined today by Professor Matt Ashton, alumnus of the University of Liverpool. Matt is the Director of Public Health for Liverpool City Council and previously served as the Director of Public Health for Sefton Council Anne Knowsley. Matt serves as an Honorary Professor in our own Department of Public Health and Policy here at the University of Liverpool. We're very fortunate also to have alumnus Councillor Barbara Murray. Barbara studied for a BA in Philosophy and her Certificate in Education in 1991. Councillor Murray is the Liverpool City Council Cabinet Member for Education, Skills and Employment. So her input today in the relevance of returning pupils to school in the light of COVID will be very interesting. She was a teacher for many years and has also served as a school governor. She now holds roles on the Council of Governors here at Alderhay Children's Hospital and is the lead member for performance and strategy at the Merseyside Fire and Rescue Authority. I'm also delighted to introduce to you Professor Rhiannon Corcoran. Professor Corcoran is the Professor of Psychology and Public Mental Health here at the University of Liverpool. She joined the university from the Division of Psychiatry at Nottingham in September 2012. She's previously held academic appointments in the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Manchester and the Department of Psychology at University College London. Professor Corcoran has over 10,000 citations for her work in this field, which is an outstanding achievement, putting her at the pinnacle of academia in her field. And then at the other spectrum, where we have Dr. Dan Hungerford, who is a PhD in epidemiology and public health, a relatively early career scientist who is going to tell us about infectious disease epidemiology and surveillance. His main research interests involve the use of real-world big data for vaccine evaluation and effectiveness studies. He has a particular interest in respiratory and diarrheal disease in the UK, perhaps the top and tail of paediatrics. Dr. Hungerford previously worked for Public Health England, specialising in infectious disease surveillance and outbreak investigation. He's worked with Liverpool John Moores University and the Centre of Public Health, developing trauma and injury intelligence group surveillance systems. Again, highly topical for today's discussion. A little bit about myself. I'm a professor of child health and outbreak medicine. I have a particular interest in the most severe nasty viral infections such as monkeypox, Ebola, influenza, and this new one, COVID. Okay. Liverpool University and the Tropical School have been at the centre of infectious disease research and pragmatic work to look after the healthcare of people with tropical disease and infectious diseases since 1898. It might surprise you to know that it was Liverpool that deployed the greatest number of public health doctors and clinicians to the Ebola outbreak in 2015. Liverpool currently is the hub for much the scientific endeavour that is being used to inform the policy for this COVID outbreak. In Liverpool, we have an outbreak laboratory, which actually is multiple laboratories, where we bring in the material from over 260 hospitals. We sort it out, we do some science on it ourselves, but we then pass the material to collaborators in several other institutions throughout the country. We've supported the development of vaccine and vaccine challenge studies. We supported the development of international standards for measuring antibody levels in people with COVID disease. We also have some of the largest data sets coming into Liverpool. And one of the studies that has just been published in the BMJ and will appear in public tomorrow looks at 66,000 people admitted to hospital in the United Kingdom and then focuses in particular on children's problems. We've been able to show a new cluster of symptoms that affects children. And this is called the multi-systemic mucocutaneous enteric syndrome. So here we have in this slide clusters of symptoms that children experience. And this large major cluster at the top, previously only the few inner symptoms were recognized by the WHO, but using data from throughout the United Kingdom, researchers working in Liverpool in collaboration with those in Edinburgh and Imperial College London and some in Glasgow have identified a broader group of symptoms which will allow the WHO to redefine the multiple systemic mucocutaneous inflammatory syndrome in children, which can be caused by COVID disease. The other clusters being the more traditional respiratory problems, and a small cluster of seizures and confusion, which we see here. And that work will be coming out in the British Medical Journal tomorrow, and we're delighted to be able to share that good news with you. Of great topicality at the moment is the issue of children returning to school. And there's much anxiety amongst the children and the parents about whether this is safe to do so. It's work conducted here in Liverpool with our collaborators that has underpinned the decision by the government to return children to school, because we've shown that severe disease in children is rare and death is vanishingly rare. In fact, in our study, we were unable to find any deaths in otherwise healthy school-aged children. And of the 6 deaths that we did identify, these occurred in children with severe underlying comorbidities, which, to put it into lay parlance, would be conditions that are considered to have been life-threatening in the absence of, or life-limiting in the absence of COVID disease. So this study has provided the confidence for Chief Medical Officer Sir Chris Whitty to make the statement at the weekend that the risk of COVID to children themselves is vanishingly rare. We do know, however, that children are suffering quite severe mental distress through their social isolation from a peer group, as well as the disadvantages of missing educational opportunities. It's only through education that we can improve children's life choices and life chances and deal with some of the inequities of our society. I look forward to hearing more on that subject from people with a better understanding than me. So, we do have some uncertain times ahead of us. I do suspect this winter is going to be quite difficult, but I am pleased and confident that I think that children will not be suffering unduly. It now stands me to introduce Professor Rhiannon Corcoran, who is going to be talking to us about the issues around the mental health and some of these aspects of children. So thank you very much. And over to Professor Rhiannon Corcoran. Rhiannon, please would you unmute if you're available, and if you're not available, I'll wait a moment. And then if Dr. Dan Hungerford could stand by to speak in the event that Professor Corcoran is not able to join us.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I'd forgotten to unmute and I am here. So let me start again. Apologies. So it's really lovely to be invited to speak at this Liverpool Responds webinar. I'm going to tell you a bit today about the survey of adults that we've been running in the Liverpool City region and how the psychosocial consequences of COVID might be different in Liverpool City region than it is elsewhere. So in considering this, we should acknowledge that our city region is full of comparatively high levels of multiple disadvantage, but it's also full of cohesive and irrepressible people who have come to be that way, in part because of perhaps an over-familiarity with economic, social, and health challenges over the years. It's a learned strength hardened by knocks and challenges and being used to not knowing what might happen next. And this may stand them in good stead in the coming months and years. So all of the analysis that we'll carry out on the data, because in fact the survey is still running currently, will include an examination of differing levels of disadvantage, because this is the kind of information that a Liverpool City region analysis can add to larger, higher profile and better resourced surveys of COVID response, such as that's led by UCL. So we're running a series of 3 surveys over 12 weeks of individual people's lives. And that gives us the opportunity to investigate change in psychosocial responses to COVID restrictions, including the potential to identify, importantly, positive responses or emerging habits that could feature in a better, more sustainable, perhaps, new normal. The question of how new this new normal ought to be is an important one that's very little discussed, but where I imagine people's ideas will differ really quite dramatically. So our analysis will explore mental health and well-being outcomes, including levels of depression, anxiety, well-being and resilience. And it will look at how individual differences in our psychologies might support different COVID impacts. And in this, we consider some fairly obvious personality factors such as introversion and extroversion, optimism and pessimism. But more interestingly, I think, and what I want to talk more about here, is our focus on a mechanism that operates at multiple levels by influencing individual psychology, by influencing society, economy, and indeed governance as well. And it's the mechanism called tolerance or intolerance of uncertainty. So what we know so far is that it's anxiety, less so depressive reactions, that are the commonest responses to this pandemic. And this is already well documented. Presumably the reported increased prescription of psychotropic medications, which is also documented in the media, is an attempt to ameliorate these perfectly understandable anxious reactions as they occur now. What our survey does that others don't do is that it has the potential to examine how levels of uncertainty tolerance actually mediate anxiety reaction. So anxiety then, well, it's not going to just be about the virus or getting the virus. It would also be about the socioeconomic repercussions of the COVID restrictions. So in returning to school, for example, there's likely to be increasing anxiety in secondary school children who are beginning to think about their futures. And in this, there are, of course, embedded inequalities as well. So those in top performing schools whose support structures are solid and predictable will be less likely to discount their future opportunities for success than are those whose educational and life chances are much less guaranteed already. So when young people discount their futures because of a negative, unpredictable situation, such as what we're currently in now, we're likely to begin to see particular life choices being made that, although seemingly maladaptive according to standards of an old normal, would be much more understandable in the new, uncertain, anxious normal. And these might include things like perhaps leaving education early to grab what jobs are available now, making more hedonic choices that support immediate gratification. And those would be things such as perhaps increasing their alcohol intake, taking substances, eating more immediately gratifying foods because the chances of more meaningful gratification of their higher order needs that could support their own self-development are perceived to be somewhat reduced. And these types of short-term, less sustainable reaction can also feature in national and local decision makers' choices as they consider what policies need to underpin a new normal. As we know from Brexit, the uncertainty and the ability of individuals and businesses to tolerate or to cope with that uncertainty remains a paramount consideration as we prepare for full Brexit. It is as if everything else in life is pinned down and predictable, as if our usual everyday life choices are not choices at all, but rather predestined routes that we mindlessly take to avoid trouble or catastrophe. As if anyone who chooses a path less trodden is dicing with unmanageable risk. So in this risk-averse context, innovation and entrepreneurialism are downgraded or dumbed down, if you like, to encompass the run-of-the-mill good idea, excluding anything really novel and possibly risky. So we come to live with and within what one real innovator, David Bowie, called the tyranny of the mainstream. The potential to fail and therefore to learn from our failures has become out of the question, intolerable. Every day in the news now, we hear of further jeopardy to the high street, of how costly office block developments are doomed to fail as a result of home working, of the perilous future of the arts and hospitality sector. And to address these worries, quick fix actions are taken by decision makers that can sometimes be against established common sense. And these include things like encouraging the consumption of alcohol on our streets, or the voucher scheme to encourage people to eat out anywhere, but most likely, especially for those with more disadvantage, to be poor quality fast food outlets. And these decisions are taken in order to buffer the comfortable, familiar, but far from perfect old normal from the immediate effects of COVID restrictions. They're perfectly understandable. But they're taken in the knowledge that our population health and well-being probably can't support or sustain them. They are consequences of an inability to tolerate uncertainty and to accept the risks associated with spiraling decline of an economy built upon consumerism. And again, as such, they're perfectly understandable. They should never, though, be considered as policies for the medium or the long term. And with the enactment of these policies, we're favouring the old normal above the, albeit uncertain, new normal. We lose some potential to make changes for the better. Evidence indicates that people took full advantage of going out into their local parks, blue and green spaces, to exercise, and it seemed that this became part of many people's COVID coping responses, more so maybe for people with no or with inadequate garden space. People will continue to do this only if their old normal lives let them, if they can fit it in. And with UK residents spending more hours in work than any other European country, what space is there in the old normal? How can the increasing urban precariat employed in the nighttime hospitality sector on 0 hours and minimum wage ever enjoy good daylight hours spent outdoors, enabling them to maintain necessary levels of vitamin D, for example? This is one example of a dangerous health challenge associated with the old normal that we're failing to address in the new normal. But isn't this an aspect of life that we'd hope might be a part of a better new normal? Now, how, with children going back to school and parents back in their offices working these long hours, can we spend more quality time with each other, building our all-important attachments, things that were valued during lockdown? How will children react to the return to school, where they may have been amongst those being bullied, or to have experienced test or social anxiety, to perhaps have had too much pressure from their parents to perform, or where their voices were not heard or their opinions not valued? How can young people in the new normal be enabled to matter when adult decision makers of the old normal dictate how things must be for them? So what of this latest move to return to the old normal, this return to school? How will we respond to it? And how can teachers make a difference to young lives where a challenging old normal future is all that we can conceptualize? How can working families hold on to the better things that happened to them or that came out of being furloughed or working from home, the reduced pollution, the return of biodiversity to our doorsteps and so on? They have little power to retain these benefits as the government takes increasing steps that favour the re-establishment of an old normal. So in summary, it seems to me that we're rapidly losing our grip on the possibility of making better futures through a new normal because we are overly reactive to risk and to uncertainty. If, as individuals and as a nation, we can be persuaded to at least accept that life is always uncertain, and to see that amidst uncertainty there exists choice, agency, and growth. To appreciate that it's the choices that we make within our uncertain worlds that make us who we are. To understand that agency is what makes us this adaptable human species. Perhaps then there might be some way to embrace and value the uncertain so that we can really begin to think about how we might rebuild better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Corcoran. That was incredibly helpful. I'm sure we will come back to you with questions at the end, and I'll be particularly interested to know what your thoughts are on the children. So without further ado, if we could pass on to Dr. Dan Hungerford, who is going to tell us. Let's just remind you, Dr. Dan Hungerford is a NIHR postdoctoral research fellow, and his interest is in the epidemiology and surveillance of respiratory and diarrheal diseases. Dr. Hungerford.
Thank you, Calum. So as Calum said, I'm going to give you a brief summary about one of our studies we're running called COVID Live. So COVID Live is a community household cohort study, which is recruiting households across the Liverpool city region, with the principal aim of this study to understand the epidemiology, immunology and transmission within household, which includes really the precise measurements of transmission and secondary attack rates in households, investigation of the virological, social and physical determinants of transmission, and to gain a real better understanding of the contribution of asymptomatic and mild infection in the community. Households are included if all individuals in the household consent to undertake regular nose swabs over an initial 12-week period, and to provide a blood sample at baseline and then after 3 months. These participating household members undergo a weekly nose swabbing routine, which they do themselves and record their own symptoms, with intensified swabbing following a SARS-CoV-2 detection, plus some additional immunological assessments to measure rates and determinants of disease transmission. This will allow us to characterize multiple parameters which may alter the risk of transmission, including viral load, so the amount of virus being shed, physical household structure and contact patterns within the household, and hopefully provide a good description of the immune response to infection over time. There are also additional complementary projects on health economics, behavioural and psychological aspects, as were beautifully discussed by Rhiannon just a second ago. These projects have been integrated within this community study to provide a unique data set to inform improved models of the pandemic and consequent decision-making around social distancing and its further relaxation. The study started recruiting at the beginning of July, just after the country had exited the lockdown restrictions, and these have been further relaxed. Therefore, the environment and the stage of pandemic that we conduct the study under is constantly changing. This means that the study has to be highly adaptable to change, and the longitudinal nature of the study will provide data through the summer months and into the winter. We also hope to follow up these households at regular intervals for a further 3 years, looking at in particular the long-term immunological profiles of the participants. Currently, we've recruited over 120 households, and we're targeting over 200 by the end of September. The study will therefore involve more than 500 participants from the local area, including both adults and children. And this will cover the period as the children return back into school, and as I said, through into the winter months, which are less certain. The study is being run through a team of scientists across multiple institutes at the university, with LSTM and Public Health England as partners. Identified through Liverpool Health Partners and our clinical research network, we've established a small team of fantastic volunteers who have given over their time and skills to make COVID Live a success. An incredible effort from the laboratory teams at the GCP lab, LSTM, and the Institute of Infection, Veterinary and Ecological Sciences has meant that the staff and laboratories were prepared to accept and process samples every day, and will likely process over 10,000 samples over the study period. It's a real testament to the collaborative efforts that are going on within Liverpool, this study. It's going to allow a collaborative response to the pandemic, which will help build working relationships and capacity across these institutes, allowing all of us to better serve and improve the health of the people in the Liverpool City region. I truly believe that this is going to be an incredibly important study for not only the region, but the rest of the UK and potentially further afield. Thank you for your time and listening to me, and hopefully I can answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Dan, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your recognition of the hard work that's been done by the Liverpool Outbreak Laboratory based at the Ronald Ross, the William Henry Duncan Building and IC2. To give people listening in an idea, pandemic studies such as this cannot be fully staffed in advance of an outbreak because you can't have a team of 16 people sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So in fact, what happens is that people were redeployed and many people volunteered and have gone way beyond the expectations of their traditional roles in order to meet this response. And it really has been quite remarkable what has been achieved in a very short period of time. So thank you very much, Dan, for recognising that. Councillor Barbara Murray is an alumnus of our university, and she's the Cabinet Minister for Education, Employment and Skills. I'm very much looking forward to hearing her contribution and thoughts on current events. Councillor Barbara.
Thank you, Calum, and thank you everyone for inviting me. It's great to have an opportunity to speak about education. My brief is actually education, employment and skills, because we believe at the council that is very connected. Firstly, I'd like to say, I think everybody knows that poverty is probably the biggest factor impacting on educational outcomes. The most recent data shows, and I've looked at this week, that closing the gap, which is an expression we all use a lot, between the most privileged and the most disadvantaged, has actually stopped happening. And indeed, it would take 500 years to close that gap. As a city, we understand that we need to improve the outcomes for all our young people as quickly as possible because it's part of our economic recovery as well. Put very simply, better qualifications at the end of your school education will lead to better work opportunities, better wages, and less poverty going forward. We have to really break that cycle. And it works from very early years. We know that if we can break the cycle, the health opportunities for young people are improved as their education is improved. So we really do need to focus down on early years and make changes there, working closely with families. I just say that because that really is the context of everything I think about in terms of education. More specifically, for us now, getting the children back to school is urgent because as a city, our outcomes are not very good. And this has really set us back because we are keen to improve things, improve the quality of education, improve the outcomes, and children not being in school has two big problems for us. One is their attainment may be impacted by this, but the second issue is we have a duty of care for their safeguarding. And if children are not in school, we can't actually fulfill that duty. So far, what has been done to ensure school is safe? Every school has been required to conduct a risk assessment. The guidelines for this have been laid down by government, but as a local authority, we've tried to work hard alongside the schools to ensure they are all, sorry, I keep losing my pace on my notes. So we're trying to work alongside schools to ensure that they are all safe, and we will be monitoring the safety of that. Currently, good news, we are expecting all schools to return next week. Plans to keep pupils safe in school are very dependent on the individual schools, but the types of measures included that could be used are working in smaller groups, operating rotas, social distancing, bubbles, and most recently, as announced this week by government, the use of masks. More simply, it could be just the fact that pupils are all facing in one direction. In terms of new cases, it's the same as for anybody else. If a child or a young person or a member of staff loses sense of smell, taste, or has a cough, they need to self-isolate. We then have to make sure that anybody who's not in school, and it's not just young people with mental health issues, there is work for them to continue with at home. Now, this could be online, or it can be, in the case of families, and we have a lot of families who don't have actually access to computers and Wi-Fi, hard copies delivered by staff to make sure they can keep up with their work. The new normal, I think, from the point of view of people in education, is blended teaching and learning. And I think going forward, we will reflect on what has happened during lockdown, the fact that most education was taking place online, how successful that was, and what elements of that success we might want to keep going forward. In terms of children's mental health, because of the COVID pandemic, I would say I've been talking with the Director of Education to several groups of young people on forums, and with the Metro Mayor as well on a forum he set up. And anxiety seems to be the biggest factor. And I can thank Rhiannon for her work, because she reflects exactly what we're finding. It is about the uncertainty. So, for example, children of secondary age are very concerned, not just about going back to school, about their journeys to school if they have to go on public transport. So everything we're trying to do is to reassure children, young people and their families that school will be a safe place. And I really welcome what Calum has just said about the likelihood of children contracting or transmitting COVID. That is reassuring, and I'm sure that'll be a great message for Matt to get out tomorrow on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Barbara Murray. Professor Matt Ashton, also alumnus and current Director of Public Health for Liverpool, has no doubt had some of the busiest 7 months of his life. I know that my head hardly touched the pillow in January and February. I can only imagine the hard work that he's had to put in the many months since. I really look forward to hearing what he's got to say to us this morning. Matt.
Thank you, Calum, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this session this morning. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'd like to make a couple of points, if I may. So, first of all, I think it's worth us reflecting on the significant direct and indirect impact of COVID on our communities, on our country. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that almost 42,000 people have died of COVID in this country. Over 570 people have died in Liverpool as a result of COVID. So the impact on our communities has been significant. There's clearly been significant indirect consequences as well, particularly on our mental health and well-being, and particularly on our most vulnerable populations. And we need to think about that right at the heart of any decisions or policy making we make. When it comes to schools in particular, I personally am absolutely delighted that schools and our other education providers are going back. I think it's absolutely essential for our children and young people to be in full-time education, to allow us to address some of those issues of inequality of aspiration, inequality of ambition, poverty, wider health inequalities, and schools are absolutely the best place for them to be. Rhiannon, my good friend Rhiannon, dropped in a David Bowie quote earlier, so I feel inspired to do the same. So David Bowie said about himself that he was an instant star. You just needed to add water and stir. And I think it's the same with our children and young people. They are stars in the making. We just need to give them the support to allow them to survive and thrive in whatever life throws at them. And it's our duty as civic society to put those mechanisms in place. I also think that we'll all have had personal experiences around homeschooling, you know, whether that's kind of direct or through friends and families, and our appreciation actually of how hard homeschooling is not to be underestimated. So I am fortunate to have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and homeschooling them has not always been a pleasure, I would say. So my my thanks and admiration for people who are actually trained in education and how to train our young people has reached new heights, as I'm sure it has for many of us. So the important thing, I think most of us would agree, the important thing is that our children and young people are back in full-time education. The question then is, how do we do that in a safe and as managed way as possible? And as Councillor Murray has outlined, we, the council, have worked very, very closely with our schools and education facilities to allow those places to be fully risk assessed, to ensure that everything they've got in place are the appropriate measures to allow them to open up properly and to allow our children and young people, and also, of course, our teachers and support staff, to be as safe as possible as well. And as Professor Semple outlined at the start, the risks, particularly around children and young people, risk of severe illness and risk of death, are very, very low. Then they are not absent entirely, and clearly our young people are a conduit for illness transmission, and so that is something we absolutely have to be mindful of, which is why our schools need to be COVID safe. And we have done a significant amount of work with that, and public health's been right at the heart of that. So we have a number of measures in place, including the schools absolutely owning their individual risk assessments, which are all published. And the important part here, I think, is that we need to build trust back up that our schools are safe places to be. So we have risk assessments published on schools' websites so that parents can have sight of that and understand the steps that have been taken. And I think the communication from head teachers to parents has been brilliant as well, and that needs to continue. Of course, we are likely to see outbreaks in schools, because we will see outbreaks in other settings as well, and COVID has not gone away. So we have in place procedures to identify cases as they arise and to respond appropriately. The likely way that will happen will be through test and trace. So a child or a child, through being a contact of a positive case, being identified and therefore staying off school and self-isolating, the school being alerted, and then the social bubble that that child is around being risk assessed, and the necessary interventions taking place at that point, which may well include their social bubble, their school bubble, being off school for a short period of time. But we would look to avoid any whole school closures as much as we possibly can do. I think my learning, and as you said, Calum, it has been a very full-on 2020, and I'm hoping that at some point it will calm down. But it looks like this is the new norm. The situation we're in is going to continue for a while. So it is essential, I think, that we all play our part in keeping the levels of COVID in our community as low as possible. And they are the standard public health messages that we've been playing out for some time. That's around good hand hygiene. It's around absolute social distancing wherever possible outside of our bubbles. And it's about the use of face coverings where we're unable to have that social distance. And of course, if people are ill, specifically with the symptoms of coronavirus, which is fever, new continuous cough, or loss of sense of taste or smell, but the additional symptoms that Calum's outlined are very useful, I think, for having that broader understanding of how the virus can transmit and manifest itself in our communities. But if people have those symptoms, then testing is an absolute essential control mechanism for us to get on top of the virus and to stop it spreading further. So there are some key things that we absolutely need to make sure we do. And when I say we, I mean the collective we as a society, not we as a public health community, and certainly not just me as a director of public health. But that is about making sure that the test and trace system that we have in this country works and operates properly, and that if people are not well, they engage with getting themselves tested, they self-isolate at home, and if people are contacted as a result of that test and trace system, then they take the steps that they are advised to do, which may well include being self-isolated. I think we absolutely have to acknowledge, though, that it is easier for some people to do that than for others. And so there is an inequalities piece right at the heart of this, where again, at a society level, but also at a public service level, we have to support people who are unable, or in some instances unwilling, to take those necessary steps. I don't think we can solve this all by ourselves. I certainly don't think the Director of Public Health can solve it by ourselves, and I don't think the university can. I think this is about society working together systematically with a common goal, a common interest, which is to keep our communities safe and well. And I think that's my kind of common shout out for us. If I may just do a very brief reflection, we had an outbreak of COVID within our Princess Park ward of the city in the last couple of weeks that we've been managing, and it was a very difficult outbreak, but the response from our community was phenomenal. And the way I have described this is our response has been with and through our community champions, our community leaders, our faith leaders, our volunteer networks, our residents of the ward, and they absolutely owned that problem. They came up with some of the solutions for how we would address that problem, and that allowed us to contain that outbreak in the Princess Park ward within a period of just over 2 weeks. It was a phenomenal result, and it shows to me two things: that prevention is absolutely the right strategy for us to employ, so very proactive and preventive approaches to get on top of the virus before it starts spreading. And secondly, that the power of our communities is enormous. And if we get our communities on side, they will go to the end of the world to help us solve the problems that are facing all of us, including communities themselves. I think I'd just like to end, if I may, thinking about the new norm and the power of communities, including the power of our young people, incident stars in the making. And it is up to us to hear the voices of our children and young people, the future of the country, the future of this world, the future of this great city, in designing exactly what we want that new norm to be, what we want this great city to look like in the future. And I very much hope that this is about kindness and respect being right at the heart of it, with equality of aspiration, equality of ambition, equality of life chances, so that we are all in here looking after each other as our kind of primary purpose, if you like. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Well, Matt, thank you very, very much. It's my turn now to introduce the question and answer sessions. But you've set a high bar, because everybody's gone David Bowie on me, which was a bit of a surprise because that's not in the briefing notes. It may surprise you to know that although he was a man of immense individual talent, when asked privately what he attributed to his success to, he quoted as saying, "I'm pretty good with collaborative thinking. I work well with other people." And I think this is the astonishing thing about some of these leading lights of science and music and art, that when you get them in private, they'll actually admit quite openly that it's part of a bigger team that has made them successful. And that is really the theme that has run through the response from Liverpool. Anyway, we're now on to the part of the session where we're going to take some question and answers. I would ask our panelists to keep their cameras on at all times and be ready to unmute as you need to. We have got a number of questions coming from Facebook, and it will take me just a moment to get to them. Anya from Facebook says that this is a very useful discussion, and thank you for the focus on children. A question from her to Barbara is just basically saying thank you. The support from the Liverpool City Council for the risk assessment has been very good, and the advice at hand has been very helpful. So thank you, Anya, for that. From Brian Finney to everyone, does Professor Corcoran have any recognised strategies for managing anxiety and risk? And is there any general place that she would advise we point ourselves to for access to materials, perhaps online, which can provide help for anxiety around the COVID outbreak?
Oh, okay. Thanks. Was that from Brian? Yeah. Thanks, Brian, for that. It's a great question, but not, as you'd imagine, that easy to answer. The key resource, I suppose, for managing anxiety will be to go to your GP in the first instance, who might be able to refer you to, if you're a young person, to CAMS services. and if you're an adult, to adult mental health services, where you will be referred to a clinical psychologist. And there are many options for tackling anxiety reactions that you might be offered, and it might very well depend on the nature of the anxiety that you're suffering. So if, for example, you're feeling very anxious about preventing risk of COVID spread or becoming ill yourself, then the kind of strategies that are sometimes used to support obsessive compulsive disorder might work well. On the other hand, if the anxiety that you're experiencing or that your children are experiencing is to do with their life chances, then this becomes rather more difficult, I think, to deal with through medicine or through clinical services. It's a perfectly, as I tried to emphasize, perfectly normal reaction really to what we're experiencing now. And more people are beginning to believe that actually it's life's experiences and not anything wrong with your brain that might make you feel more anxious about certain things. And so, just as Matt was talking about, this is about an appropriate community response more than anything else. And I wholeheartedly agree with him about his vision of the new normal and what that might look like. And so kindness, compassion, positivity, but honesty as well about what we're facing will enable young people to deal with this much better than perhaps accessing forms of clinical help. It's worth, and who should have access to those? Well, all of us. We are a community. We are dealing with this together. But particularly, I suppose, parents and teachers, who, of course, are the guardians of our children's futures, would be the most important people to engage with this kind of thing.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. That's very helpful. In the interests of the very limited time, if you don't mind, I'm going to move on because there's one more question coming, which is related to this, but could also come across into perhaps Matt's area of expertise. Ruth Watling, who is a, I think if I could spill the beans, was an amazing contributor to Alder Hey and led the dietetic service there for many years. She has asked, there was a marvelous volunteer response earlier on in the pandemic. Might there be some consideration for a similar voluntary response to support ongoing education of children, particularly those who have limited access to information technology or are in hard to reach communities? So could there be scope for a volunteer response there? Perhaps if you could give us a brief thoughts on that from Councillor Barbara Murray, perhaps.
Sorry, Calum, could you repeat the question? I was just answering stuff on chat.
Ruth Watling asks, Ruth Watling notes that there was a remarkable volunteer response in the early phase of the pandemic. Might there be an opportunity to do a similar response targeting young people to provide support for education, particularly in those in harder to reach communities?
Yeah, absolutely. We closed the phone line when we got 3,000 volunteers. We're looking very closely at this because wearing my other hat, employment and skills, volunteering is actually often a route into employment, and it's a way you can transfer your skills. So yes, very important. We would be looking all the time to raise the awareness really of young people as to the type of employment there is, and also to give them better and more meaningful work experience. And I think, yes, volunteering is very much something we could be thinking about going forward. We do need to be innovative. We are expecting unemployment to rise from 4 to 10%, which is approximately 55,000 more people will be unemployed going forward. And to go back to Rhiannon's point about certainty and uncertainty and anxiety, if the future looks bleak, I think people lose their aspirations. And really in the city here, We need to be improving the aspirations of our young people against this terrible context. And I think volunteering is actually a very good way to do that. And yes, definitely. Other things we are looking at is things like the apprenticeship levy to get some really purposeful, high quality apprenticeships. And the combined authority is actually working and has presented several papers to draw down funding to support us in these endeavours. Thank you. Thank you very much,
Councillor Murray. Professor Matt Ashton, next one would be coming to you. Has there been any, so it's a question from Sophie Archard, and she asks, what are the particular thoughts on addressing the rising anti-mask, anti-vax and QAnon movement? What can Liverpool do, particularly in our local community, to address the anti-movement, which is anti-science, anti-masks, anti-vaccination movement? Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Calum. If I may, I'll very quickly just come back on the previous point as well. There's an African proverb which is that it takes a village to raise a child, and I think we absolutely as a society have a role to support our children and young people as they take those next steps into the future, into their ongoing life. I think there's absolutely a role for formal education and for formal educators, formally trained educators. And I don't think I'm not sure that was the question, but I don't think that volunteers should replace the formal education role, but I do think that as part of a wider society, that informal education should be fulfilled by all of us. And that's some of those things about, kindness, compassionate, giving young people opportunities, actually listening to our children, young people, listening to their voices, understanding what their fears and concerns are, and actively seeking ways to work with them to solve some of those problems. So absolutely think we all have a role in that broader education piece. To the specific question you've asked, it is a big concern around anti-mask, anti-vax, and I have to say that anti-vaccine campaigners is nothing new. We've been dealing with this for a long time in public health. I think where we fail as a public health strategy is doing the we're right, you're wrong type approach. So telling people that they don't know what they're talking about, and actually, that the science all tells us that the vaccines are safe and that masks are the right way to go, I don't think really works, because if people aren't in that space, they're just not going to listen anyway. And of course, public health is not just the science, it's the art and science. So I really think this is about how we use our communities to identify community champions, community leaders, trusted individuals. And trust is so important in our communities, trusted individuals in the heart of our communities to put some of those messages across. And I think we really have to start with telling real life stories. And actually, around the vaccine agenda, we're very good, aren't we, with some of the stories of success. So polio would be a great example of that in Africa. I think we need to localize those examples and give it some flavor locally for people to understand, to allow us to address that. I think we need to take a really hard line when people are actually spreading false truths as well. So I'm not saying we kind of let that stuff pass, but a really hard line in particular instances. But mostly this is about working with our communities, working with that community understanding. And the final point is, particularly around face coverings, is, of course, as we know, the science is emerging around this, and we have to be able to explain that the science is emerging on this. Face coverings, and this might be a personal view, Calum, but face coverings are part of the overall solution. They are not the solution in itself. They're part of a range of measures that we can use to reduce population risk of virus transmission. But you try and put that in a soundbite on Twitter, and it can be quite hard. So we have to be creative and innovative about how we get some of those messages across. But final point, not done unto, working with our communities and with our trusted champions to get those messages across.
Thank you, Matt. That was very clear, and a subject very close to my heart as a paediatrician. If I may follow on, there is now a movement towards recognizing that the pale male in the small screen is probably not the way to take our communities with us, and that instead we should be, if you like, fighting back using the same skills that the social influencers have learned, and therefore encouraging interaction with local celebrities and local influencers and peer peer groups to take the messages that are important around public health. And there have been some very good examples where particularly some of the local footballers and their wives and girlfriends have made really huge impact in particularly smoking, but other aspects of healthcare. And I think this is one aspect where Liverpool, again, could lead the way, because we have some of the best football clubs in the country, and also many great leaders in music and culture. So I think we should be able to work out how best to influence that. We have a question from Paula Williamson, again, a professor at the University of Liverpool, I do believe, asking about the effect of air and air changes in rooms. This is actually one of the areas that's not been very well addressed in public health policy, but rather strangely was very well addressed in the design of schools in the earlier part of the last century. In fact, walking around a number of grammar schools, I was surprised by how many originally had open corridor designs between the rooms and had window blocks to prevent the windows being fully closed, even in the winter. The marks where they've been removed are quite obvious. So this is not actually a new concept, and I do suspect that some of the modern moves to improve housing energy efficiency may have led to reduced air exchanges in some of our environments. I do know that there's a subgroup of scientific advisory groups for the emergency working on guidance around air changes in rooms, both for education, higher education and further education environments. But this is going to be a problem, and it does conflict somewhat with the movements for essentially wrapping our houses in plastic and making them more heat efficient. I think it's going to be a very difficult challenge to address on that. I have been told by our organisers that we may overrun by 5 minutes. And so I'm very happy to take a couple of more questions. I'm just scrolling through the list to find ones that don't repeat other aspects that have been asked. We have one from Jennifer Connor asking about the waiting lists for hospital services and child and adolescent mental health services. I'm afraid there's no one on the panel that would be able to give you chapter and verse on that, but I do know that at Alderhay Children's Hospital, we are been asked to increase the capacity across all clinical specialties to try and get up to about 120% of activity of what we were doing before. And Councillor Murray has asked if she could address this point herself.
Yeah, I think it's really crucial that we understand early intervention. Teachers, staff in schools are being trained up actually to identify the very early stages. I am a great believer in the mental health of schools and the simple question, where do you feel today on a scale of 1 to 10? We're doing a lot of work currently under the radar. We have schemes like Trailblazers and designated staff in schools to start doing this before the condition becomes chronic, if you like. And we all understand there's a bottleneck for CAMHS, but not all children actually need to wait these long periods for these appointments. We should be trying to head this off quite early. And I am really of the opinion that we should be teaching children how to monitor their own mental health. And that really starts with teaching adults to do that, because as a society, we've more or less ignored this until it becomes chronic. That's my view.
Thank you very much, Councillor. We have, in fact, the popularity of the session is so great that the questions are coming in so quickly that it's actually hard to keep track of them as they flash up and down the screen. So thank you very, very much, everybody. I'm just trying to pick out one. This question's been raised about access to information technology. This appears to be a theme from a number of callers, wondering about if there's an ability to improve information technology and internet access across the city to address inequity. That's quite an interesting question, one that I've not seen before. Again, I wonder if that would address both health inequity and educational inequity. I think Barbara is ideally placed to address that.
We are supporting 5G, and I think the Metro Mayor is very keen on the move to digital. The problem with 5G is people are scared of it. There is a lot of strong feeling that it is bad for our health. And when we try to get planning permission for masts and the likes, there is a resistance. But, you know, that is progress to be able to have the speeds people want. I think we're going to have to move to 5G, and I'm interested to watch what the government's doing currently with the Chinese orders and things. So one to watch, definitely.
Well, thank you very much. Addressing that issue from a personal position, the issues around health, both for children and adults, show that obesity is a very strong risk factor for severe COVID disease, amongst many other aspects. What drives obesity is often poverty and education. So we do have to have this joined up understanding of health. Infectious diseases often reveal the weaknesses in health and our societies. I was strongly encouraged by the response of Liverpool to increase the size of the cycling lanes, to encourage the use of cycling lanes. And I would love to see similar increasing in public transport so that we can have less crowding in the buses, but actually just more buses, more trains, perhaps bring in the trams, so that we can ultimately, when we move out of this outbreak, have something good to rely on that has improved our access to healthy travel and clean air, both subjects close to my heart. Professor Corcoran has come in, and this will be our last point before we wrap up for this morning. Professor Corcoran.
I wanted to reinforce the point about how important improving digital inclusion is going to be now. It's always been a topic that's worked, particularly, I think, to exclude older people more so than younger people. But as we move through this pandemic, I think it's likely that much more of what we do on an everyday basis will be remote. And so it's absolutely essential that we get this right.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure speaking to you as a community. It is quite remarkable, the diversity of response that Liverpool has mounted to COVID. And this is great to hear how there's so much crosstalk and working together across both health, social and educational sectors. I'd like to thank all our speakers for their time this morning, and also to thank the technical team at the University of Liverpool who've made this such a slick operation. Our next event in the Liverpool Responds series will take place on Wednesday, the 16th of September. So that's Wednesday, the 16th of September. The focus will be on football. Please could you keep an eye on the events page for these events. We will be broadcasting them through this method, and we'll be keeping them available on site on Twitter and the website. So thank you very much, everybody. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Please follow us on the social media. We're all keen to engage and let you know about our work. Thank you very much.